"Dad, you can't just leave. Where do you think you're going to go?" That was the last thing my son Trevor said to me before I picked up my bag and walked out the front door of what I had, foolishly, thought was my home. I didn't answer him. What was there to say? I had already said everything. For months I had said everything, and none of it had changed a single thing. So I just kept walking, down the front steps of that house in Mississauga, past the recycling bins I had dragged to the curb every Thursday morning since I moved in, past the rose bushes his wife Nadine had planted the spring before and never once watered, past the mailbox I had fixed myself because the hinge was broken, and Trevor kept saying he'd get to it and never did. I walked past all of it and I didn't look back. It was a Tuesday in early November, one of those grey Ontario days where the sky looks like a sheet of old dryer lint and the cold gets into your joints before you even realize you're outside. I had $62 in my wallet, my CPP card, a change of clothes, and a photograph of my wife Elaine. My Elaine, not the daughter-in-law. They happened to share a name and I never once found that funny. Taken at a campsite near Algonquin in 1987. She's laughing in the photo. She's always laughing in the photos I kept. Elaine passed 3 years before this story begins. Breast cancer, fast and merciless, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I won't spend too much time on that part because I don't think I need to. If you've lost someone like that, you already know. If you haven't, I hope you never do. After she died, I rattled around our house in Hamilton for about 8 months. We'd lived there for 26 years. I knew every creak in the floors, every draft that came under the back door in January, the exact angle you had to hold the shower handle to get the temperature right. The house knew me too, I think. But it was enormous for one person, and I was 67 years old, and my knees were getting worse, and the stairs were getting harder. And Trevor kept calling. "Dad, it doesn't make sense for you to be alone up there. We have the space. Nadine and I talked about it. We want you to come." He called like that 4 or 5 times over the spring. Patient, warm, using that tone people use when they're doing what they believe is the right thing. I resisted at first out of some mix of pride and practicality. I had my own life, my routines, my neighbors, my Tuesday morning coffee with my buddy Stan from the old plant. But the house went quiet in a way that was different from peaceful. And one Sunday in June I went to church alone and sat in the pew where Elaine and I had sat for 20 years, and I just thought, I am so tired of being alone. So I said yes. I sold the house. After the realtor fees and the outstanding property taxes and the small amount left on the line of credit I'd taken out the previous year for the roof, I cleared just under $90,000. Trevor knew about the sale. He didn't ask me for anything directly. I want to be fair about that. But it came up in conversation that they were thinking about finishing the basement, that the mortgage renewal was coming up at a higher rate, that Nadine's car needed work. I'm not stupid. I heard what was underneath all of it. So when I moved in, I gave them $30,000. I told myself it was for the renovations to make the basement livable for me, and that wasn't entirely wrong. But really I was buying peace. I was buying belonging. I also told them I wanted to contribute to the household. I was getting my CPP, about $1,100 a month, plus a small pension from 31 years at DeFasco, the steel company in Hamilton. Together, I had around $2,200 a month coming in. I offered to pay $900 a month toward groceries and utilities. Trevor said that was more than fair. I thought so too, at the time. The first month was all right. The basement was finished, not beautifully, but adequately. There was a small bathroom, a living area, a bedroom. I set up my things. I put the photograph of Elaine on the bedside table. I came upstairs for dinners and tried not to be in the way during the day. Their kids, twin boys 7 years old named Jaden and Cody, were loud and chaotic, and I loved them fiercely from the start. That was the one uncomplicated part of the whole arrangement. The second month, things started to shift in ways I couldn't quite name at first. It was small things. The way Nadine would go quiet when I came upstairs in the afternoon. The way she stopped setting a place for me at dinner without saying anything, so I'd come up and have to get a plate myself. The sighing. Not at me directly, but near me, around me, the kind of sighing that fills a room with a mood even if no one says a word. I asked Trevor about it once. He said I was imagining things. Then in December, Nadine asked if I could try to stay in the basement before 7 in the morning, because the boys were sleeping and my footsteps on the stairs were waking them up. I said of course. I started making my coffee down there on a little 2-cup machine I bought at Canadian Tire. That was fine. Then in January, Trevor sat me down and said they needed to talk about the household contribution. He said $900 a month wasn't really covering my share. He had a number in mind, $1,400. I looked at him. Trevor, that's more than half my monthly income. Dad, you have to understand what it costs to run a household these days. Groceries are through the roof. Hydro rates went up again. We're not trying to take advantage of you, we're just being realistic. Nadine was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug, and she didn't look at me once during that conversation, which told me exactly who had done the math. I agreed to 1,400. I didn't know what else to do. February brought something worse. I take medication for my blood pressure. Have for 15 years, completely stable on it, nothing dramatic. I get it through my pension benefits plan, so it's largely covered. But in February my coverage had a gap. A formulary change. Some bureaucratic thing, and for 1 month the prescription cost me $48 out of pocket. I mentioned it at dinner. Just mentioned it the way you mentioned something annoying that happened. Nadine looked up from her plate and said, "Well, I guess that gets added to your costs for the month." I said, "I'm sorry? We're already covering your food, your heat, your water. If your medication costs are going up too, then maybe your contribution needs to reflect that." Trevor didn't say anything. He looked at his food and didn't say anything. That was the moment I understood. Not the arrangement. Not the financials. I understood what I was to them. I was a line item. I was something to be managed. After dinner I went downstairs and I sat in the chair by the small window that looked out at the base of the backyard fence, and I thought about Elaine. I thought about how she always knew what to do when something felt wrong. She had this way of just cutting through to what a situation actually was. No softening, no detour. She would have told me quietly what this was, and then she would have told me what to do about it. I missed her so badly that night I couldn't breathe properly for about an hour. March was when it broke me. Trevor's company had some kind of team event, a weekend thing, a ski trip to Blue Mountain. They were leaving on a Friday afternoon. The boys were going to Nadine's mother's place for the weekend. On the Thursday night, Nadine came downstairs. She almost never came downstairs, and stood in the doorway to my little living area. She said, "I just want to make sure we're on the same page about the weekend. We're going to be gone, and obviously I don't want you having people over or using the main floor. We'd prefer if you kept to the basement." I said, "Nadine, I'm 68 years old. I wasn't planning a party." She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "I know, I just like to be clear about expectations." After she went back upstairs, I sat there for a long time. I had given them $30,000. I was paying $1,400 a month. I was not allowed to use the upstairs of the house during the weekend. I started making calls on Friday morning, while they were loading the car. I called the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic about tenant rights. I called a social worker at the city of Mississauga about seniors housing. I called my old buddy Stan, who lives in a seniors building in Ancaster, and has been telling me for 2 years it was the best decision he ever made. By the time Trevor came downstairs to say goodbye, I had already made my decision. I don't know what he read on my face. Something, I think. He paused at the bottom of the stairs and said, "Dad, you good?" I said, "I'm fine, Trevor." He nodded and went back upstairs, and I heard the front door close, and I sat alone in the basement for a while. And I thought about what I had been willing to accept, and for how long and why. I'm not going to pretend it was all Nadine's fault. Trevor was a grown man who sat at dinner while his wife implied his father's blood pressure medication was a financial burden. And he looked at his food and said nothing. That's a choice. Every single time he said nothing, that was a choice. The following Monday I gave 2 weeks' notice to my son. I put it in writing, which felt absurd, but the social worker I'd spoken to suggested it was wise. I kept it simple. I told him I appreciated the effort, but I needed my own space, and I would be moving out. He called me twice that day. I let it go to voicemail. The first message, "Dad, come on. You don't have to do this. Let's talk." The second message, 3 minutes of him explaining that the arrangement had been expensive for them, that they'd sacrificed to make space for me, that I was being ungrateful. Ungrateful. I had given them $30,000 and paid $1,400 a month for 8 months, and I was ungrateful. I didn't call back. In the 2 weeks that followed, I was as invisible as I'd been the whole time, except now nobody pretended it was comfortable. Nadine made it clear she thought I was making a scene. Trevor alternated between silence and short bursts of guilt-tripping that he seemed to believe were reasonable conversation. The boys didn't understand what was happening, which was the only thing that hurt me in a way that wasn't anger. Jaden asked me one night if I was going on a trip. I told him I was going to get my own apartment and that I'd visit. He seemed to accept this with the straightforward practicality that 7-year-olds have. I loved him for it. I had 2 main options in front of me, and I want to be honest about both, because I think this matters. Option 1, affordable seniors housing. There are co-op buildings and subsidized units in the Hamilton area, but the wait lists are long. I put my name in. My social worker said the wait could be 12 to 18 months. That wasn't my immediate answer. Option 2, a private rental. With my CPM pension, just over $2,200 a month, a 1-bedroom apartment in Hamilton was going to be tight. Not impossible, but tight. The average one-bedroom in Hamilton was running around $1,500 at the time, which would leave me $700 a month for food and medications and everything else. I was thinking through all of this, feeling the particular low-grade dread of arithmetic that doesn't quite work out, when I got a text message from a woman named Rosemary. I should explain who Rosemary is. Rosemary Holt had been my wife's closest friend for over 20 years. They met in a ceramics class at the rec center in the mid-90s, and they were inseparable after that. Coffee every Wednesday, weekend drives to the farmers' markets in the summer. The kind of friendship that women of that generation built quietly and completely. When Elaine got sick, Rosemary was there in a way that I will never forget. She drove Elaine to half her chemo appointments when I was still working. She slept on our couch the week before Elaine died. She was at the funeral with her husband Gerald, and then Gerald had a stroke the following year, and now she was living alone in the house she and Gerald had owned in Dundas, which is a small, pretty town just west of Hamilton. Rosemary and I had stayed in occasional contact after Elaine died. A text at Christmas. A phone call on Elaine's birthday. Nothing romantic. I want to be clear about that, and I'm not saying it defensively, it's just true. She was Elaine's person. She'd become someone I trusted. Her text said, "I heard from Stan that things aren't going well at Trevor's. I don't know what your situation is, but I have a room. It's yours if you need it. No pressure, no strings. Just thought you should know." I read that text 4 times. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed in the basement, and I cried for the first time since I'd made my decision, and I'm not embarrassed to say that. Sometimes the thing that breaks you open isn't the cruelty. It's the kindness you weren't expecting. I called her back. We talked for almost an hour. She had a spare room, a proper one, with its own entrance from the side of the house, and a small sitting area. She wasn't looking for a tenant, she was clear about that. But she lived alone, and the house was too big for one person, and she missed having someone around. She didn't want anything from me except a reasonable contribution toward groceries if I was willing, and maybe company at dinner when we both felt like it. I said yes. Moving day was on a Wednesday in April. I rented a small van for the afternoon, $200 from Enterprise, which I note without bitterness because at least it was my $200. I had Stan and his son help me. We had everything moved in 3 hours. Trevor was at work. He had said the night before in the tone of someone making a final reasonable appeal, "Dad, you don't have to do this. We can talk about the arrangement." I said, "Trevor, we've been talking about the arrangement for 8 months. I'm going to go." He looked at me, and I want to be fair about this, because whatever else he was my son, and I could still see the kid he used to be when he was looking at me with something that confused itself for good intentions. And he said, "I just don't want you to be alone." And I said very gently, "I know." Because I believed him on some level. I believed that he meant it. I also believe that meaning well is not the same as doing right, and that at some point the gap between those two things becomes a place a person has to leave. The room at Rosemary's was smaller than the basement in Mississauga, but it felt larger. It had a window that faced east. In the mornings, the sun came through and landed on the floor in a long rectangle that moved across the room while I had my coffee. I started to notice things like that again, small things, morning things. I hadn't noticed anything like that in months. Rosemary and I fell into a routine without really planning one. I made coffee most mornings. She made dinner most evenings, though I insisted on cooking twice a week, and it turned out I'd forgotten how much I actually enjoyed cooking. We watched the news together sometimes. She was sharper on current events than I was, and had opinions she wasn't shy about sharing, which I found refreshing after months of conversations I'd had to carefully navigate. Some evenings she'd bring out the ceramics she still made in a little studio off the back of the garage, and I'd sit out there and watch her work. She was good. She had a real instinct for it. I told her that once, and she laughed the way Elaine had laughed in that photograph. That whole-body unself-conscious laugh, and I had to look away for a second. I got a call from a legal clinic in June. The $30,000 I had transferred to Trevor when I moved in, that was trickier than I expected. Because I had transferred it voluntarily, without a formal loan agreement, there wasn't a clean path to recovering it. I talked to a lawyer for an hour. The advice was, document everything going forward, consider a demand letter, and manage my expectations. I manage my expectations. I'm 68 years old. I know when to spend energy and when not to. What I did do was file for the guaranteed income supplement. I had never applied for it because I assumed my pension and CPP put me over the threshold. But after running the actual numbers with a financial counselor at the Hamilton Community Legal Clinic, I found that I qualified for a partial GIS payment of around $220 a month. I didn't know that. I don't know why I didn't know that. I'd been leaving money on the table for 2 years out of ignorance and some inherited pride about accepting government support that I had no rational basis for. I also enrolled in the Ontario Drug Benefit Program, which covered my blood pressure medication fully. $48 a month covered. All of this is to say I was not suddenly wealthy. I was not rescued. I was not found by luck in a cinematic way. I sorted through the real, practical, unglamorous business of figuring out how to live within what I had, in a place where I was treated like a person. That, it turns out, was enough. That was more than enough. Trevor called in September. It was a Sunday evening and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. He said he wanted to apologize. I let him talk. He talked for a long time. He said that Nadine and he had been going through a difficult period, financial stress, pressure at work, and that they had handled things badly. He said he was ashamed of some of what had been said. He said the boys asked about me. I told him I appreciated him calling. I told him I wasn't ready to come for Sunday dinners yet and I didn't know when I would be, but I wasn't closing a door. I told him I would like to see the boys and that we could figure out something simple, a neutral place, a park somewhere. He said okay. His voice was different on the phone than it had been in the house. Smaller, somehow. I don't mean that cruelly. I just mean that whatever authority he had performed in his own home wasn't performing on the phone between us, and what was left was just my son, who had done something I wouldn't have believed he was capable of, and who was apparently surprised to discover the same thing about himself. I said, "Trevor, I'm all right. I need you to know that. I'm actually all right." There was a pause and he said, "Good, Dad. I'm glad. I meant it." And I think he believed me because it was true, and truth has a different sound than reassurance. In October, Rosemary and I drove up to Algonquin for 3 days. We stayed in a cabin near Opiongo Lake, the same general area where Elaine and I had camped decades before. The trees were in full color, that particular Ontario fall color that you can't quite describe to someone who hasn't seen it, that red that isn't quite red, that orange that leans into gold. We walked in the mornings and cooked over the wood stove in the evenings and talked about a lot of things. Her kids, my kids, Gerald, Elaine, the strange fact of being old and still finding things to want. On the last night, we sat outside after dark and I thought about the man I had been 11 months earlier, sitting in a basement in Mississauga, not allowed on the main floor of his own son's house, counting the cost of his blood pressure medication. I thought about what Elaine would say if she could see me now. She would say, "It took you long enough." She would be right. Here's what I want to say to anyone listening who recognizes something in this story, any part of it. Your children's love is not a transaction, and if they are making it one, if they are putting a price on your presence and making you feel the cost of your own existence, that is not love. That might be many things. It is not love. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to ask for help from places that aren't your family. You are allowed to call the community legal clinic or the senior support line, or your old friend Stan or whoever it is in your life, who has been quietly waiting to be asked. You are allowed to sit by an east-facing window in the morning and watch the light move across the floor and feel, for the first time in a long time, that this is your life and it is still happening and it still belongs to you. I am 68 years old. I live in Dundas, Ontario with my late wife's best friend, who makes ceramics and has strong opinions about municipal politics and laughs like the world is still surprising her. I am, against some odds, doing fine.